Hello and welcome to a standard deck profile. This time we're going to be talking about Absolute Zero. This is a deck that's kind of interesting. We don't usually get defense-oriented decks in Standard or in Vanguard in general very often, and so they're always worth taking a look at when we get one. This has a very interesting effect that I'm also considering trying out in Premium because it's very similar to the card Hanli. If you are a Standard-only player, Hanli is a card that forces the opponent to play Counterblast after the fourth battle. And this forces the opponent to discard a card after the third battle, on the fourth or more battle. So this potentially can tax the opponent's resources a lot, and this deck actually hits surprisingly good numbers and draws quite a few cards. So I think there's some potential here to explore this, even though it's a deck that hasn't topped basically at all in Japan. I think it'll still be the kind of deck that if you really like grindy defensive decks, that you can have a lot of fun playing. And on top of that, I've also made this a bit of a budget build. A lot of lists running around right now are playing Francette, which is a Chris Ring card that costs like $30 or something, and they're playing a playset of it. And the new support, generic support for Lyrical, that's the grade 2 that soul charges and counterblasts the draw card and is like $20 right now. So I've trimmed those cards out of the deck and played some cards that are slightly cheaper, but this isn't still what I would consider a full budget build. I'm not playing the cheapest possible option at every turn. I've just taken some of the more expensive cards out of other people's lists. I'm also not playing the order package that some lists are playing, because that card is also expensive. So we're playing just stock Absolute Zero and Judge Maidens and with some generics thrown in. And I'll show at the end the flex slots that can be basically whatever generic lyrical cards you want. So you can also consider cards you can change to make your own cost-saving measures. But let's start with the ride line. You have to play the full ride line. We've got Absolute Zero Rix, and then we've got the grade 1 Absolute Zero Clio. This is the one of the best grade 1s in a ride line I've seen in a long time. What this does is when it's placed by writing from this grade 0, you look at the top 7 cards and choose up to 1 card with Absolute Zero or Judge Maiden. So our ride line cards say Absolute Zero, and all the support cards say Judge Maiden. This means this card can find Persona rides, and you add that card to hand and you shuffle the deck. So right off the bat, we're getting a refund for our discard for ride, and this deck has lots of ways to get incidental benefits from discarding to ride, so this ends up just being pure advantage. And then as an act skill on R, if your Vanguard's a grade 3 or greater unit with Absolute Zero in its card name, and your opponent's Vanguard's also grade 3 or greater, you can discard a card from hand, and you get red text, all your front row rear guards get plus 5k. That's a really strong effect in this deck, because we are going to multi-attack with our front row, so we're getting essentially an extra 20k power out of this activation, and it can also help us hit just over some nice magic numbers. But more importantly, it's a way to discard in the main phase, which can then fuel our Vanguard skill and let us draw some cards. Next up is the grade 2, Absolute Zero Kashua, and we're actually going to play some of these in the main deck too. This one doesn't do anything right away, but when it's rode over by the grade 3, you can call the grade 1 from Soul to R. And you're usually going to call this behind Vanguard, because this deck plays Yuika, and we want the other columns free for Yuika. And then when this attacks a Vanguard, if you have a grade 3 or greater Absolute Zero Vanguard, you get plus 5, and then until end of that battle, plus 5 till end of that battle, and then at the end of the battle, you retire this unit and draw a card, which is a similar effect to Boulder Axe from Varga. And we're using it for a similar purpose. We're just going to use this to clear open a front row R spot so that we can superior call from the drop zone later in the turn. And then we have the centerpiece of the deck, Absolute Zero Sagitta. This has the continuous skill. You and your opponent's units get continuous red text V and R. If it is the 4th battle of this turn or more, when this unit would attack, it cannot attack unless you discard a card from hand. That's important. It means that they don't even get to declare the attack if they don't have the cards to discard. And this is really going to tax the opponent's resources. And considering the number of cards we're going to draw and how we have ways to break the symmetry of this, we're going to end up grinding the opponent out of resources slowly over the course of a game, as well as punishing them for multi-attacking us too hard, because then we'll be able to, if we survive, pressure them with really big numbers and possibly kill them. And then this has, as an act skill on V, once a turn, Energy Blast 4, and this unit gets plus 10k and drive plus 1 until end of turn. That's a really good skill. We're essentially getting free triple drive because the card we're going to discard for most of our cost is going to generate 1 energy whenever it's discarded, and thus we will always be able to play this energy for every turn if we're playing our deck correctly. And then when this card is when your card is discarded from hand by card ability during your turn, you can counterblast 1 and draw a card, which is nice. This just lets you get some. This lets you refund the discard for your stuff and plus up a card. And we don't have a ton of uses for counterblast. We have, I think, exactly 3 ways to use it really. So we often can afford to just pay the counterblast to draw a card, and it's a really solid way to just continue getting various pluses and grind the opponent out. Next up is the main deck, and we'll start with 3 copies of Persona Ride. We really want to Persona Ride every turn to hit the biggest numbers possible. Not much else to say. Next up is our multi-attack enabler. This is Sky Colored Tranquility Judge Maiden Arca. This has the effect that when it's discarded from hand during your turn, if you have an absolute 0 Vanguard, you get to energy charge 1, which is going to help us hit that energy charge 4. And if we discard one of these on all of our write-ups, we can actually sometimes have way more energy than we need. And then when you're grade 3 or greater Vanguard with absolute 0 and its name attacks, if you do not have a unit with the same name as this card, you can call this card to R from your drop. So this we'll discard this to pay for costs and for our tax effect for attacks, and then we will just call it from drop to get the full value back. And then it becomes a 10k attacker until end of battle when it attacks if we have the grade 3 absolute 0. So we're basically paying no cost for our 4th or more battles and for our various discard effects, because this card is just going to call itself back, and the opponent is losing a card each time, but we're essentially not changing our resources at all. It's really solid. Next up, we have one of our support cards. This is Light of the Flower Garden Judge Maiden Riania. That's a hard to pronounce word. This is similar to Ease Out in the Shoujo Doji deck. What it does is when it's placed on R, if you have a Vanguard with absolute 0, you counterblast 1, look at the top 5 cards of the deck, and you choose an absolute 0 or Judge Maiden and its card from among them, a card with Judge Maiden or absolute 0 in its name from among them, and reveal it and add it to hand, and then shuffle the deck. And then on R, when it attacks a grade 3 or greater unit, it gets 5k. Just a nice little 15k attacker, but it helps us find copies of Persona Ride. It helps us find copies of Arca while we're trying to set up our drop zone. Just a decent card overall, and it's not a once per turn, so if we have a ton of counterblast, we can just burn a bunch of these to get a bunch of cards to hand. We're also not, it's not super critical to keep this in play as an attacker, so we can feel free to intercept with it. And we have Yuikas in this deck, so we can use this effect multiple times over the course of a game. And the next up is 3 copies of Kashua from the Ride line. This just retires and draws a card when it attacks, and then it clears open a rear guard spot for Arca to call itself from drop 2 without us losing any units. Just a really nice effect to have access to, and it's a 15k attacker when it's a rear guard, so it'll do nicely with our other cards. And then next up is where it gets a little weird. I'm playing 2 copies of Valshablan and 1 copy of Dazzle Bubble Paradise Pressia. Valshablan is the Soul Blast Ride Cycler. When you discard this during your ride phase, you Soul Blast 1, puts it on the bottom of the deck, and you draw a card. And then when it's placed on R, if you Persona Road this turn, you can counterblast 1, choose one of your rear guards, and it gets all of your front row units get 5k. Choose one of your vanguards, sorry, and all of your front row units get 5k. So this is nice because we have exactly 2 turns that we can afford to Soul Blast while we're riding up. We can, on the first turn, we can afford to Soul Blast out the 0 because we don't actually need the 0 in Soul for anything. And then we can afford to Soul Blast out the 2 when we ride up to 3. We just don't want to Soul Blast out the 1 when we ride up to 2. As long as we keep the 1 in Soul, we're good to go. So exactly 2 Valshablans is exactly enough to do that without having to worry about like having to not Soul Blast one of these and just lose the card. And same with the Energy Cycler. Over the course of a game, you'll have exactly 3 extra energy because you'll get 3, and then you'll get 3, and you'll be at 6 energy. But then if you discard any copies of Arca, you'll gain additional energy charges. And so when you energy blast 4 from 7, you'll go back down to 3, and then you'll energy charge 3 on the next turn. And then you'll go up to 7 when you discard an Arca, and that'll be the game state for the rest of the game, unless you play one of these, in which case you will, at some point, energy blast down to 1, and then you'll be at, when you loop Arca, you'll be getting exactly back to 4 every single turn. So the downside of this is that if you do use this, that means if you ever miss on discarding Arca for a turn, that you will then kind of lock yourself out of activating Sagitta's skill, but that's probably not going to be a big deal. And because you can always play Counterblast for this if you want. And then it has the effect, in addition to being an energy cycler for Ride, if you Persona Road, you can Counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3, choose one of your units until end of turn it gets plus 5k, and if you chose a rear guard, return that unit to hand from R at the end of the turn. So this can give you some nice board bounce, reuse some of our on-place effects, just a nice little bit of extra value out of a card that maybe we have no opportunity to discard early and we drew it late. Same with Valshablan. Getting that front row 5k is really strong in the late game if we somehow didn't get to discard these to Ride and we drew it later. And these cards are moderately pricey. Valshablan is down to less than 20 now as of the last time I checked, and Prescia is, I think, floating around 20. But you don't really need the Prescia. This could easily just be another Valshablan if you have those from before, or if you think spending like $13 on this is better than spending like $20 on this. And you don't need to play any of these. These are all these 3 cards are all optional. You could play basically any generic lyrical card in this spot, and it would be fine. But I do really like Valshablan, at least as a 1 or 2 of, because we can use Yuika to bounce back to hand. We can search for Persona Rides with our grade 2 and with our grade 1 from our Ride line. So we often have multiple ways to find Persona Ride, and thus are likely to Persona Ride on back-to-back turns multiple times in one game. And thus we could use Valshablan 2 to 3 times in one game easily if we can keep bouncing it with Yuika and keep Persona Riding. And that's going to really help because the grade 1 can give us 5k to the front row, Persona Ride can give us 10k, and then this can give us another 5k. So our front row can be plus 20, which hits really good numbers, especially with Yuika's boosting. That'll make basically every rearguard hit a magic number, which is really strong. So I do recommend, if you have Valshablans, or if you have the money to get them now that they've been reprinted, to pick some up and throw them in the deck. Next up is our grade 1s, and we have 4 copies of Yuika, which is this is the one card that is non-negotiable for this deck. You kind of have to play it. It does so much for us, and it's floating around $20 like it always has been. But it's easily the best bang for your buck in terms of improving this deck's power output. We have multiple on-place effects that are really strong. We have this one, and we have the Valshablan, and those are really good to abuse, but also bouncing back our Arca gives us a really strong synergy. The 4th attack is the one we have to discard for. So if we attack with Arca boosted by Yuika as our 3rd battle, we can Soul Blast 1 and bounce this to hand, and then when we attack with the other column, we can discard the Arca that we just bounced, get it into the drop to set it up for next turn, and get the Energy Charge 1. And that will be really good at making sure we can loop our aggression every single turn. This deck does the exact same 4-attack pattern every turn for the whole game. And in theory, as long as you play correctly, there's no end to this loop. It doesn't rely on Counterblast. It relies on a resource you get back every turn. So this card is absolutely essential. This is the non-negotiable card. If whatever budget you have, spend it on getting the 4 Yuikas first. Next up is 4 copies of Surreptitious Prayer Judge Maiden Crawley. I think that's it. This card is one of the weaker cards on the deck, but it serves a nice role. When it's discarded from hand during your turn, if you have an absolute 0 Vanguard, it goes to Soul. So it helps build Soul to pay for those Yuikas, which is nice. And then if you have an absolute 0 Vanguard, this is a 10k shield guard. So it gives you a little bit of additional shield value. It's an absolute, it's a Judge Maiden, so you can find it with your Ride line and with your grade 2, which is nice for deck thinning, and discarding it and getting it into Soul will be just like a nice little resource generating synergy there. And then we have our perfect guards. 3 regular PGs, 1 Elementaria. You could play 4 PGs if you really want, but any lyrical PGs will work. The nice thing about lyrical is that you have several art options for most of your staples. And then here comes the flex slots. And this is why I said this deck is somewhat budget, because some of these cards here are not what I would call budget options, but are generic staples that you probably should have anyways if you're playing this game, like Angel Ladder. You probably should have gotten an Angel Ladder right away when they first got printed, because you needed these to play against Shiranui, and basically every deck needs one. This card is totally optional for this. It's a nice way to build soul, draw a card, and protect our Yuikas, because we're going to bounce our front row basically every turn. And it's good against Shiranui and Shoujo, so it's really solid to have. You could play Forbidal and play some grade 3s to search if you wanted. You could play Radiance Caliburn to get some counter charge or card draw, depending on what you need. You could play the Persona Ride Order, but I wouldn't really recommend that. And you could play Twin Cast for extra defensive power, or even Evergreen Transfer. Really, any Regalis piece would work. And it's not super critical that you play any of them in particular, but I'm playing Ladder for the matchup spread. And then we have 2 copies of Proper and Gentle Judge Maiden Mariellis. This is the worst card in the deck, easily. This card does almost nothing. At the end of the battle, it attacked. If you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with absolute 0 in its name, you retire this unit, choose one of your opponent's grade 2 or less rearguards, and retire it. So it gives you a little bit of board control, and reducing their resources while also forcing them to discard for their attacks can really run them out of cards. And it clears open a rearguard spot for your Arcas to call themselves from drop too. So it kind of helps the deck out a little bit. And it's common, and that's its biggest strength, is that it's cheap. You could easily replace these with any of the more expensive staples. These would be the first things to cut for francettes if you have any. You could also play the new support card that soul charges 1 and then counterblast to draw when it's on place, because we can reuse that card with Yuika, and that'll be another way to spend your counterblast. But for now, I have these. And then 2 more generics. We have the Jeweled Beast. This card puts 2 cards in the Ride deck from drop or soul back into the Ride deck face up, and then gives you either 20k shield if you guarded with it, or it lets you pick up a card with the same name as your Vanguard from your soul or drop and add it to hand if you called it to rear, which is nice. You can get Persona Ride back with this. So if you know you have a ton of shield value in hand and the opponent's not likely to kill you, you could play this to make sure you can guarantee Persona Ride to finish the opponent off on the next turn. Or you can just hold on to this to have the most shield value possible, which is what I usually do. Just a solid, flexible card, and we want 1 copy at most. And we also could live without it. This could be literally any staple you want. And then we have Adelheid. This is a weird addition to the deck. It's mostly just here to help us fight their defenses a little bit. When the opponent drive checks a defensive or damage checks a defensive, this unit gets 10k power and 10k shield, which is nice. Means we can guard for this as a 10k if the opponent hit a trigger, and then it also will basically negate one of the opponent's damaged triggers for when we're pushing through the offense. And then it has the effect that at the end of the battle, attacked while boosted, you can soul plus 1 and either choose one of your other rear guards in the same column and bounce it at the end of battle, or you can remove an over trigger from drop and choose it to 1 unit with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard from your hand and call it to R. So if we've guarded with the over trigger, we can use this to get 1 more attack, which is a nice little thing we can surprise the opponent with. And considering that we can give a static plus 20 to the front row on our maximum power turn, that can be a nice little 35 to 40k attacking unit, depending on what we call. And it will cost us another discard, because our Vanguard will force us to pay discard for all additional attacks after for the 4th battle or more. But if we're doing it to finish the opponent off, it's probably worth it. And then next we have the triggers. We're playing 4 effect crits. You don't really need these, but every now and then you won't have enough soul to pay for Yuika, and you can put one of these into soul and guarantee it. And another thing to note is that we usually call this grade 1 to back row center, and then it boosts the Vanguard, which is a 13. This makes an awkward number. This is 21 by base, but usually it'll be 31 or more. And using the effect crit can bump that back up to a magic number by adding +2. And then next we have 4 vanilla crits. We just want to play 8 crits because we're a triple drive deck, so we want as many crits as possible to punish our opponent for 2 to passing our triple drive Vanguard or no guarding when they hope that we can just hit nothing. We're going to hit crits and kill them. And then next we have 4 vanilla heals. There is not really much reason to play the effect heals right now because the best deck in the format is not affected by either the restand heal or the crit heal. And then next we have 3 fronts. You can also play draw triggers in this deck, of course, but the fronts will help us hit better numbers and give us a little bit of much needed kill pressure without having to increase the number of attacks we do. There are other combos you can play in this deck, like playing a Passionado Justine, which calls itself when it's discarded for Soul Blast 1, that will give you additional attacks, but the attacks generally will be very low quality and will cost a lot of resources because you'll have to discard a card for each of those attacks after the third battle. So, in my opinion, it's better to just go for a consistent 4 attacks every turn that doesn't cost very much resources, and these fronts will help make those 4 attacks much more threatening. And also being 20k shield will help us guard very specific numbers in this format, which is nice. And then last, we have the Overtrigger, and you can literally play whatever Overtrigger you want. I'm playing the Lyrical one because I have an FR one, but the blue Overtrigger will give you another crit and let you pick up cards in the drop, like Perfect Guards and other important pieces. The red OT will give you 1 more attack in a deck that doesn't get very many attacks, which can be a lot of pressure, but that extra attack will also force you to discard a card, which will be offset by the OT drawing a card. The light OT will clear the opponent's board, punish your opponent for 2 to passing your Vanguard, and will also just draw you a bunch of cards, which is good in a grindy defensive deck. Drawing extra cards will help us survive to the late game, and we don't generally deck ourselves out, so it's not bad to play that one either. And then the Dark OT will pick a card up from damage and then call something, which will give you, again, another attack, but also will heal you 1 damage, so it'll help you survive into the late game again. So there's some merit to every OT except the vanilla OT. The Lyrical OT will help you hit absolutely tremendous numbers because your columns will be getting effectively plus 20, and Arca gives itself plus 10 and is attacking for 20 base. With Persona Ride and the grade 1 skills activation, we have 15 to the front row, so that's often anywhere from 43 to 48 on that column, and we can make that much bigger with this. So we can get to the point where all of our columns are hitting for over the Overtrigger guard number and become PG or die numbers, which can drain a lot of cards out of the opponent's hand. They're guarding with 3 to 4 cards or using a perfect guard on every swing for the rest of the game. So that's why I like this one. Over the course of a long game, it generates the most value, whereas the other OTs generate a lot of pressure on the immediate turn that you first check them. And the blue OT will randomly kill your opponent if you hit that plus a crit. Well, that's the deck, so let's cover the pattern that you should be looking for. We'll have our Vanguard. We'll have our grade 1 from the ride line behind the Vanguard. Because it's going to get called out by the ride line, we'll always have this unless the opponent kills it. We will try to get 2 Yuikas. 2 Yuikas is the dream, but it's not always going to happen. And then any useful grade 2 in 1 column, any useful attacker period, something that you want to reuse on the next turn. And then something that dies or that we don't care about in the other column. Something we're fine calling over or fine losing. And then hopefully you've discarded Arcas in the course of riding up or in the course of paying for your costs. You're going to Energy Blast forward to get your Vanguard 10k in a drive. Your front row is going to have, if you went second, your front row will have 5k from this skill. And if you went first, you will not. And then you will have 5k on this rear guard, always. If you are going second, or if it's turn 4, this rear guard will have 5k. And if you sequence correctly, you'll probably have 5k on this Yuika in this column, but you probably called this Yuika on turn 3, and you probably called this on turn 2 to get the counterblast and check top 5 effect, so this Yuika probably doesn't have any power. So you would attack here. It's your first attack of the turn. You would retire this and draw a card. And then you would swing with the Vanguard, which will then call this automatically when the Vanguard attacks. It'll get 10k. Regardless of whether your opponent's on grade 3 or not. You'll get triple drive. Then you can attack here. You can Soul Blast 1. You can bounce this to hand with Yuika's effect at the end of battle. And then you attack lastly with this column, and you can discard this to pay for the cost, which will energy charge you 1. Assuming you're at 0 energy at this turn, on the next turn, you'll energy charge to 4 and have exactly enough to pay for your Vanguard skill again. On a Persona Ride turn, these numbers will be much better. On turn 4, we'll have a minimum 10k to the front row from Persona Ride. We will have 10k, and then because it's the Persona Ride turn, our opponent must be on grade 3 unless they purposely didn't ride for some reason. So we will discard a card for this cost, which will give our front row another 5k. Our Vanguard will activate and give itself 10k. If we have any copies of Valshablan in hand, instead of calling something like this, or if we intercept with this in the last turn, we can try calling Valshablan, activating its skill. This would give us another 5k to the front row. This means that our front row now is plus 20, which is really good. If we had to call this Valshablan, this Yuika is active. We can attack here. This is 15, and then plus 20 for 35. Then retire, draw, and then swing Vanguard. Call this out from drop. It gets 10k. Our Vanguard is now attacking for 43.51, and this is why I said the soul crits are nice in this deck. If we had boosted with a soul crit on the first attack, for instance, instead of this Yuika, we could make this a 53, which would be a better number. But this is already still really good. So we're going to get triple drive again. Doesn't matter what the drive checks are, really. We're getting, and then once again, we can swing with this column, Soul Blast 1, bounce it. And then when we attack with this column, we can discard that Arca to get the energy that we needed, and then we can Soul Blast bounce this Valshablan. If we have another Persona Ride, we can do this exact same setup again the next turn. And this last attack here was attacking for 30, 40, 53, and this Valshablan over here was attacking for 30, 43. So you can stack triggers over here to make this also 53, or you can stack a trigger over here to make this 63 and make it hit over guarding with the over trigger, which is really powerful. As you can see, all of these numbers are 2 to 3 card guard, depending on whether opponent is playing fronts or not. And that's really powerful. The weakest attack was this first swing here before we called the Arca, and this was still attacking for 35, which is over a front trigger. It's still 2 card guard. It's really solid. And then if they're taking any of these early hits, then this triple drive Vanguard is really threatening, and they probably have to perfect guard it. And because we do a lot of deck thinning with our ride line, getting a check, top 7 check, this card giving us a top 5 check, we can potentially hit a lot of triggers. But even if we don't, as long as we hit enough triggers to survive the opponent's next turn, we are usually fine. And it's worth considering that if the opponent has a lot of cards in hand and is at low damage, it's often better to just bully their rear guards and not give them counterblast, especially against decks like Shoujo Doji, because by controlling our opponent's ability to throw big numbers and multiple attacks at us, we can draw the game out into a longer game where we eventually will hopefully out-resource them. There are some decks that can match this deck easily in resource generation, and thus can punish us for our own game plan. And there are some decks that have defensive power to rival ours, so that while we can't kill them, they can't kill us, and so the game just goes on forever. And if their deck has slightly more offensive power, then we lose. So there are a lot of things holding this deck back from being a top-tier deck. But I still think it's really interesting to play. And triple drive combined with numbers that are hitting in the 40s and 50s means that some number of games you're just going to end up winning because the opponent didn't see any perfect cards and they had to just take everything, or they had to 2-pass stuff, and then your Vanguard hit double trigger and you just won the game on the spot. So that's the deck. It's not too hard to play. It's mostly just keeping in mind that you have to get this card into your hand and discard it every single turn to make sure that you have the 4 energy to pay for the Vanguard skill, because getting triple drive is really important in this deck. You also somewhat have to manage your counterblast because there is no countercharger in this deck. So deciding whether to use this card or Valshablan or to draw a card of the Vanguard skill is an important decision tree. Typically after I've got all the pieces I need, like I found my Arcas and I have if I have a copy Persona Ride in hand already and things like that, I don't bother activating this because once you get into the mid game and late game, you've actually thinned a lot of the Judge Maidens and Absolute Zeros out of your deck, and if you activate this and you whiff, it's really bad. So it's better in those cases to draw a card with this or to use a Valshablan skill on place. And again, as you can see, really the only important cards for the deck are these, the Yuikas, the named cards from the ride line, and that's really it. Once you have these cards at the ride line and the triggers and PGs and stuff, The rest of the deck's pretty flexible. This card's nice to have, but it's not essential. It's still pretty good to play. And thus, you can kind of make the remaining slots whatever you want. I'll show all the flex slots again so you can see how much room you have to work with. Okay, yeah, that's all. So again, we have these 7 flex slots. These are absolutely flex slots, and none of these are essential to the deck functioning. And then 1 copy of this arguably is not necessary. You could even play fewer if you really wanted. You could go down to 2 copies, and so you could end up with something more like 9 flex slots. That could be just any good generic lyrical cards, or any future absolute zero support that we get that improves the deck's power. But that summarizes that's the video. Give this deck a shot. If the core of the deck is extremely cheap right now, the generics are really where your wallet starts hurting. Hopefully, if you've been playing lyrical, you already have Yuikas from other points in the past. But it has a lot of printings, and it's still floating around $20. You also don't need the full 4 copies of this. You could play 3 copies, or even 2 copies if you're feeling really greedy. So that's another way you can save money with this deck. Yeah, that's it. That's Absolute Zero. I personally really liked the art on this card and really liked the defensive effect. Keep your eyes peeled for when I look at this in Premium. I am going to cook something up, because in Premium, when we stride over Absolute Zero with a G unit, we do not have Absolute Zero on our Vanguard circle, and so we do not have to pay the cost for the discard. So we can do all of our good Bermuda Triangle stuff in Premium, and then at the end of the turn, we go into Sagitta when we destride, and the opponent now has to discard a card for their multi-attack. And maybe that will be something interesting, especially if we combine it with Hanali. But I'll be working on that, so keep a lookout for that video when it hits my channel. And as always, good luck card fighting.